Imagine a quiet evening many years ago. The world is darker, slower, and far simpler than today. Streets are lit only by candles. Horses pull carts through muddy roads. And in a small wooden house somewhere in America, a sickly boy struggles to breathe. The boy is weak. Doctors believe he may not survive long. He spends many nights awake, fighting illness, staring at the ceiling, while the rest of the house sleeps. Most people who saw him as a child believed he would live a quiet and ordinary life. They were wrong. That fragile boy would grow into one of the most energetic, fearless, and fascinating leaders in American history. A man who would charge into battles, explore wild rivers, hunt in distant lands, write dozens of books, and eventually become the President of the United States. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. But the strange thing about Roosevelt is this: he was never supposed to become strong. He was never supposed to become powerful. And he was certainly never supposed to become the man who would reshape an entire nation. Tonight we will slowly travel through the life of this remarkable man. A story filled with quiet struggles, surprising courage, and moments that changed history forever. But this is not a story of loud battles and shouting crowds. Instead, imagine sitting beside a warm fireplace while someone calmly tells the story of a life that unfolded step by step across the 19th century. A life that began with weakness but slowly grew into strength. A life that moved from the quiet streets of New York to the vast wilderness of the American West. And along the way, we will discover something unexpected. Theodore Roosevelt was not simply born brave. He built his courage piece by piece. Like a craftsman building a house, he carefully shaped the person he wanted to become. That journey began on October 27th, 1858, in New York City. At that time, New York was already a busy and growing place. Ships crowded the harbor. Horse carriages rolled through narrow streets. The city was full of merchants, sailors, bankers, immigrants, and workers. Tall brick buildings stood beside wooden houses that had been built decades earlier. Gas lamps flickered along the streets at night, casting a soft yellow glow across the sidewalks. It was a world far removed from modern life. There were no cars, no electric lights, no telephones. News traveled slowly through newspapers and word of mouth. Travel took days instead of hours. But inside one comfortable brownstone house on East 20th Street, a family welcomed a newborn boy into the world. The child was named Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. His father, Theodore Roosevelt, Sr., was a respected businessman. He was known as a generous and kind man who helped many charities and supported people who were struggling in the city. Friends often described him as one of the most decent men they had ever known. Roosevelt's mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, had come from the American South. She was warm, charming, and deeply devoted to her children. Together they created a home filled with energy, conversation, and curiosity. The young Theodore was surrounded by siblings' books and constant activity. But from the very beginning there was a problem. The boy was often very ill. He suffered from severe asthma attacks that left him gasping for air. Sometimes he could barely breathe. Nights were especially difficult. His father would sometimes carry him through the streets late at night, hoping that the cool air might help his son breathe again. Imagine the scene: a worried father walking through dark streets while holding a struggling child in his arms. Those nights could last for hours. Doctors at the time had very few treatments for asthma. Medicine was limited and often ineffective. The family could only watch and hope the attacks would pass. Because of his health problems, young Theodore could not run and play like other boys. Physical activity often triggered his illness. But instead of becoming bitter or withdrawn, the boy developed something else: curiosity. When he could not run outside, he read. When he could not climb trees, he studied animals, insects, and birds. His bedroom slowly turned into a small, personal museum. He collected bones, insects, feathers, and small animals. He studied them carefully and tried to understand how nature worked. This private collection became known inside the family as the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. For a child barely strong enough to play outside, it was an extraordinary project. He labeled his specimens, he recorded observations, he carefully organized everything like a real scientist. Theodore Roosevelt was still only a boy, but his mind was already exploring the world. His parents encouraged this curiosity. Books filled the house. Conversations about history, science, and politics were common during family dinners. Learning was not forced on the children. It was part of daily life. The young boy listened carefully to everything around him, and slowly, quietly, a powerful mind was beginning to grow. But despite his intelligence, there remained one painful truth. His body was weak. His father understood that this weakness could shape the rest of Theodore's life. One day he spoke words that the young boy would never forget. "You have the mind," he said, "but you do not have the body. And without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should." Those words planted an idea in Theodore Roosevelt's heart. He realized something important. Strength was not only something people were born with. Strength could be built. That simple idea would change everything. The weak boy who struggled to breathe began dreaming of becoming strong. At first, it was only a quiet decision inside his mind. But soon it became something much bigger. Young Theodore began lifting small weights in a homemade gym that his father helped build. He practiced boxing and simple exercises. Progress was slow and sometimes painful, but the boy refused to stop. Each day he pushed himself a little further. Each week he felt a little stronger. Over time, the weak, sick child slowly changed. Muscles grew where there had once been frailty. Confidence replaced fear. The boy who once struggled to breathe now dreamed of adventure. And this transformation was only the beginning. Because the same determination that helped him strengthen his body would later shape his entire life. It would push him toward challenges that most people would avoid. It would lead him into politics, war exploration, and leadership. The story of Theodore Roosevelt is not simply the story of a famous president. It is the story of a person who decided that his limits would not define him. And as the years moved forward, that decision would echo across the entire nation. The quiet, sick boy from New York was slowly becoming someone the world would one day remember. The decision to become stronger did not transform Theodore Roosevelt overnight. Change came slowly, one day at a time. The weak boy who once struggled to breathe now began waking each morning with a new purpose. His father had given him simple but powerful advice. If you want to improve your mind, you must also improve your body. Those words stayed with him. They were not spoken as a command. They were spoken as a challenge. Theodore accepted that challenge with quiet determination. Inside the Roosevelt home, a small gym was built so the boy could train even when his health made it difficult to go outside. It was simple. A few weights, some bars for exercise, nothing impressive. But for Theodore, It became the place where he slowly began changing his life. At first, the exercises were exhausting. His lungs burned and his arms trembled with effort. But he kept going. Every day he lifted weights. Every day he practiced boxing. Every day he tried to push his body a little further than before. The progress was slow, but it was real. Over time, the boy who had once been fragile began to grow stronger. His shoulders widened. His confidence grew. The asthma did not disappear completely, but it no longer controlled his life the way it once had. At the same time, Theodore continued to feed his endless curiosity about the world. His interest in animals and nature only grew stronger as he got older. He loved exploring parks and fields whenever his health allowed it. Birds fascinated him the most. He carefully observed their habits and recorded what he saw. Sometimes he would spend hours studying a single bird, how it moved, how it built nests, how it searched for food. He began writing detailed notes about these observations. In many ways, young Theodore was already acting like a natural scientist. His childhood museum continued to grow. Shelves filled with specimens, drawings of animals, carefully labeled collections. Visitors to the house often smiled at the strange sight of a young boy proudly showing off bones and insects as if they were great treasures. But to Theodore, they truly were treasures. Each specimen was a small piece of the natural world that he could study and understand. His parents supported this passion even when it seemed unusual. They believed curiosity was something to encourage, not suppress. And this encouragement helped shape the way Theodore saw the world. He believed learning was an adventure. He believed questions were more important than easy answers. But life inside the Roosevelt home was not limited to science and study. The family also traveled frequently. These journeys became some of the most important experiences of Theodore's childhood. During the 1860s and early 1870s, the Roosevelt family spent long periods traveling across Europe. For a young boy, this was an extraordinary opportunity. He saw cities that most Americans of that time would never see in their entire lives. Paris, with its wide boulevards and busy streets. London, with its enormous buildings and crowded markets. The Alps, with towering mountains that seemed almost unreal to a child from New York. These travels opened Theodore's eyes to the size and complexity of the world. History came alive in front of him. Castles that were hundreds of years old. Ancient ruins that told stories from distant centuries. Museums filled with art and artifacts from civilizations long gone. Instead of learning about these things only through books, Theodore saw them with his own eyes. He walked through them. He listened to guides explain their stories. He asked endless questions. His curiosity often surprised the adults around him. Many children would have been bored during long tours of museums or historical sites. Theodore was fascinated by them. At night, he wrote letters describing what he had seen that day. His observations were thoughtful and detailed. Even as a teenager, he had begun developing the habit of writing about everything he experienced. Writing helped him understand the world. It helped him organize his thoughts. It allowed him to reflect on what he had learned. These early travel experiences also strengthened his growing love of adventure. Climbing hills and exploring forests gave him a sense of freedom he had never known as a sick child. He discovered that physical activity could be joyful rather than painful. The more he pushed his body, the more confident he became. Slowly, the weak boy who once struggled for breath was transforming into someone very different. Yet the transformation was not only physical. Theodore was also learning discipline. His father remained one of the strongest influences in his life. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. believed deeply in responsibility and service to others. He spent much of his time helping charitable organizations in New York. Sometimes he brought his children along so they could see how many people in the city lived in poverty. These visits left a deep impression on young Theodore. He realized that life was not easy for everyone. Many families struggled just to survive. This understanding helped shape his sense of duty. Success was not only about personal achievement. It was also about helping improve the lives of others. The lessons from his father became part of Theodore's character. Hard work, responsibility, courage, compassion. These ideas would stay with him for the rest of his life. But as Theodore entered his teenage years, another challenge appeared: the question of what he would do with his future. His parents believed strongly in education. They wanted their son to develop his mind as much as his body. Theodore had already shown a strong love for reading and writing. Books filled his room: history, science, philosophy, adventure stories. He read everything he could find. Sometimes late into the night, his curiosity seemed endless. Friends and relatives often noticed how intensely he focused on learning. When Theodore became interested in a subject, he studied it with incredible energy. He did not simply read about it. He wanted to understand every detail. This intensity would later become one of the defining traits of his personality. Eventually, the time came for Theodore to attend college. In 1876, he entered Harvard University. For many young men, this would have been an intimidating step. Harvard was one of the most respected universities in the country. The expectations were high, and the academic work demanding. But Theodore approached the experience with excitement rather than fear. He saw college not as an obligation, but as an opportunity. An opportunity to learn more about the world and about himself. And he intended to use every moment of it. When Theodore Roosevelt arrived at Harvard in the autumn of 1876, he carried with him more than books and luggage. He carried years of quiet determination. The weak child who once struggled to breathe had already begun shaping himself into a stronger person, and now a new chapter of his life was beginning. Harvard University in the 19th century was very different from the modern university people imagine today. The campus was smaller and quieter, but it was already known as one of the most respected places of learning in America. Brick buildings stood around open, grassy courtyards where students walked between lectures discussing ideas about science, politics, literature, and philosophy. Young men came from wealthy families across the country, hoping to prepare for careers in law, business, government, or education. For Theodore, this environment was both exciting and challenging. He was not naturally the strongest student in every subject, but what he lacked in natural ease, he replaced with intense effort. He approached his studies with the same determination he had once used in his small gym at home. If a subject seemed difficult, he simply studied it longer. If a book seemed complicated, he read it again until the ideas became clear. His favorite subjects were history and natural science. These fields allowed him to explore the same curiosity that had filled his childhood museum of animals and bones. He spent long hours reading about explorers, soldiers, scientists, and political leaders from different periods of history. Each story fascinated him because it showed how individuals could shape events far larger than themselves. Roosevelt also continued writing constantly, his notebooks filled with observations and reflections. Writing had become a habit for him almost as natural as breathing. Through writing, he practiced organizing his thoughts clearly and directly. This skill would later become one of his greatest strengths as a speaker and author. But Harvard was not only a place for academic learning, it was also a place where young men tested themselves socially and physically. Theodore joined various student activities, including boxing and rowing. These sports were demanding and sometimes rough, but Roosevelt welcomed the challenge. Years earlier, physical activity had been difficult because of his asthma. Now he threw himself into sports with enthusiasm. Boxing became one of his favorite activities. It required courage, quick thinking, and endurance. Roosevelt was not the largest athlete, but he fought with remarkable determination. During one boxing match, he was struck hard in the face and suffered a permanent injury that damaged the vision in his left eye. For many people, such an injury might have ended their interest in sports. Roosevelt refused to let it stop him. Instead, he simply continued training and competing as best he could. This stubborn resilience became a defining part of his personality. While some students at Harvard focused mainly on social life, Roosevelt balanced many interests at once. He studied hard-wrote essays, trained physically, and continued observing nature whenever possible. Even in the middle of academic life, he found time to study birds and animals around the campus. Friends often noticed that he moved through life with extraordinary energy. He walked quickly, spoke quickly, and seemed eager to experience everything at once. This intense energy sometimes surprised people who knew his childhood history of illness. Few could imagine that the lively young student had once struggled simply to breathe through the night. Roosevelt also formed friendships that would influence him for many years. Harvard introduced him to other young men who were deeply interested in ideas, politics, and public service. Conversations often stretched late into the night as students debated questions about the future of the country. America in the late 19th century was changing rapidly. The Civil War had ended only a decade earlier. Industries were expanding. Cities were growing. Railroads stretched across the continent, connecting distant regions of the nation. New opportunities appeared everywhere, but so did new problems. Workers struggled in dangerous factories. Political corruption often influenced government decisions. Wealth and poverty existed side by side in expanding cities. Roosevelt listened carefully to these discussions. He began thinking seriously about the role that government and leadership might play in shaping a fairer society. At the time, he had not yet decided to enter politics, but the idea of public service was slowly taking root in his mind. During his years at Harvard, Roosevelt also completed one of his first major writing projects. Fascinated by naval history, he wrote a detailed study of naval battles during the War of 1812. This research eventually became his first published book, titled The Naval War of 1812. Publishing a serious historical book at such a young age was unusual, and it immediately gained attention among historians. The book showed Roosevelt's ability to analyze complex events and present them clearly. It also revealed his lifelong fascination with military history and strategy. Yet despite these successes, Roosevelt's time at Harvard was not without sadness. During his senior year, His beloved father became seriously ill. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. had always been a guiding force in his son's life. His encouragement, kindness, and moral example had shaped Theodore's character since childhood. When news came that his father had died in 1878, Roosevelt was devastated. He later wrote that the death of his father was the greatest sorrow he had ever known. The loss deeply affected him. For a time, he struggled to focus on his studies. Yet even in grief, he tried to honor his father's example by continuing to work hard and live with purpose. Roosevelt graduated from Harvard in 1880. He had not been the top student academically, but he had gained something equally important: confidence. He had proven to himself that determination and effort could overcome many obstacles. The young man who left Harvard was no longer the fragile child of earlier years. He was strong, energetic, and increasingly ambitious. Yet his future path was still uncertain. Some expected him to continue studying science or history. Others thought he might pursue a legal career. Roosevelt himself remained open to many possibilities. But events soon pushed him toward a direction that would change not only his life, but eventually the entire nation. When Theodore Roosevelt left Harvard in 1880, he stood at the beginning of adult life, with many possible paths ahead of him. Some young men in his position would have taken time to rest after years of study, but Roosevelt rarely slowed down. His energy pushed him constantly toward new goals. At first, he decided to study law. He enrolled at Columbia Law School in New York, hoping to understand the legal system that shaped American government and society. The study of law required patience and attention to detail. Students spent long hours reading complex legal texts and examining court decisions from the past. Roosevelt approached this work seriously, but he soon realized that the routine of legal study did not excite him in the way history and public affairs did. Sitting quietly in law lectures felt limiting to someone whose mind was constantly searching for larger challenges. At the same time, he continued working on his historical writing. His book about the naval battles of the War of 1812 was receiving attention from scholars who were impressed by the depth of research done by such a young author. Roosevelt enjoyed writing because it allowed him to explore big questions about leadership courage and national strength. Yet even writing began to feel like preparation for something greater. Roosevelt had always been fascinated by the idea of public service. His father had spent much of his life helping charitable organizations and working to improve conditions for people living in poverty. Those examples stayed in Theodore's mind. He began to believe that government could also be a powerful tool for helping society improve. New York in the early 1880s was a city full of opportunity, but also full of problems. Political corruption was common. Powerful political groups sometimes controlled elections and government decisions in ways that benefited themselves rather than the public. One of the most famous of these organizations was known as Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was a political machine that held enormous influence over New York politics. It controlled jobs contracts and many political appointments. For many citizens, it represented the worst side of political power. Roosevelt believed the system needed honest leaders who were willing to challenge corruption. Instead of simply complaining about the situation, he made a bold decision. He would run for public office. In 1881, when he was only 23 years old, Theodore Roosevelt ran for a seat in the New York State Assembly. Many people doubted that such a young candidate could succeed, But Roosevelt campaigned with remarkable enthusiasm. He spoke directly to voters about the need for honesty in government and fair laws for ordinary citizens. His energy impressed people. His speeches were clear, passionate, and filled with conviction. When the election results were counted, Roosevelt had won. Suddenly, the young man who had only recently finished college was now a member of the New York State Assembly. The experience placed him directly inside the world of politics, where decisions affecting thousands of people were made every day. The Assembly building in Albany became Roosevelt's new workplace. Inside its halls, legislators debated laws that shaped the future of the state. Roosevelt quickly developed a reputation as one of the most active members of the Assembly. While some politicians avoided conflict, Roosevelt often challenged powerful figures who he believed were acting unfairly. He introduced laws designed to improve government transparency and reduce corruption. This approach did not make him popular with everyone. Some experienced politicians considered him too aggressive or idealistic. They believed the system worked best when people avoided challenging established power. Roosevelt disagreed strongly. He believed political leadership required courage. If a law was unjust, it should be changed. If corruption existed, it should be exposed. His willingness to speak openly about these issues attracted both admiration and criticism. Newspapers often wrote about the young assemblyman who seemed fearless in debates with older and more experienced politicians. During his time in the Assembly, Roosevelt also continued developing his understanding of social problems affecting workers and families. The industrial growth of the late 19th century had created enormous wealth for some business leaders. But many workers faced long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions. Factories sometimes operated with little oversight, and accidents were common. Roosevelt believed the government had a responsibility to protect citizens from unfair treatment. He supported laws designed to improve working conditions and limit some forms of corporate abuse. These ideas were still controversial at the time because many powerful business interests opposed government regulation. Roosevelt understood that change would not come easily, but he remained committed to pushing for reforms he believed were necessary. Outside of politics, Roosevelt's personal life was also changing rapidly. In 1880, he had married Alice Hathaway Lee, a young woman from a respected Boston family. Alice was intelligent, charming, and deeply supportive of her husband's ambitions. Their marriage brought Roosevelt great happiness during his early years in politics. Friends often noticed how proud he was of his wife and how much he enjoyed her company. The couple eventually welcomed a daughter who was also named Alice. Yet life does not always move in simple or predictable ways. In 1884, tragedy struck Roosevelt with devastating force. On the same day, both his young wife Alice and his mother Martha died in the same house in New York. His wife died shortly after giving birth to their daughter, and his mother passed away from illness only hours later. Roosevelt was overwhelmed by grief. The double loss left him emotionally shattered. For a man who usually moved through life with unstoppable energy, the sudden weight of sorrow felt almost unbearable. In his diary that night, he wrote only a short sentence: "The light has gone out of my life." These words revealed the depth of his pain. For many months, Roosevelt struggled to find direction again. Politics suddenly seemed distant and unimportant compared with the personal loss he had experienced. Instead of remaining in New York, he made another dramatic decision. He left the city and traveled west to the vast open lands of the Dakota Territory. There, in the American frontier, Roosevelt hoped to rebuild his strength and find peace away from the memories that filled his home in New York. The Dakota Territory during the 1880s was still a rugged and untamed region. Wide grasslands stretched across the horizon. Small towns served as centers for ranchers, farmers, and travelers moving through the frontier. Life there demanded physical endurance and practical skill. Harsh winters, strong winds, and unpredictable conditions made survival challenging. For Roosevelt, the frontier offered something he desperately needed: distance from grief and the chance to test himself in a completely different environment. He purchased a ranch and began learning the life of a cattleman. Days were spent riding horses, managing livestock, repairing fences, and traveling long distances across the open plains. The work was physically demanding, but Roosevelt embraced it. The frontier required the same qualities he admired most: courage, independence, discipline, and resilience. Local cowboys were initially surprised to see a former politician from New York trying to live as a rancher, but Roosevelt quickly earned their respect through hard work and determination. He rode through blizzards, hunted wild game, and participated fully in the daily challenges of frontier life. These years in the Dakota Territory became some of the most important in shaping Roosevelt's character. They strengthened his physical endurance and deepened his love for the natural landscapes of America. More importantly, they helped him recover emotionally from the tragedy that had shaken his life. Slowly, the sense of purpose that had once driven him returned. Roosevelt began writing again, describing the frontier experience in books and articles that captured the rugged beauty of the American West. And although he had stepped away from politics for a time, the lessons he learned on the frontier would later influence the way he governed the nation. The wide plains of the Dakota Territory stretched farther than Theodore Roosevelt had ever seen. Endless grasslands rolled toward the horizon under enormous skies that seemed almost too large for the human eye. The wind moved constantly across the land, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rivers. For someone who had spent much of his life surrounded by the crowded streets of New York, this landscape felt almost unreal. Here, there were no busy avenues filled with carriages and noise. Instead, there were long, silent distances, broken only by the sound of hooves or the cry of a distant bird. Roosevelt arrived in this frontier world during one of the most difficult periods of his life. The death of his mother and his wife had left a deep wound that city life constantly reminded him of. In the Dakota Territory, he hoped to begin again. The ranch he purchased was located near the Little Missouri River. The area was still wild and unpredictable. Winters were brutal and could bring powerful snowstorms that lasted for days. Summers were hot and dry with sudden thunderstorms that rolled across the plains without warning. Living in such an environment required strength, patience, and resilience. Roosevelt threw himself completely into the life of a rancher. He learned to ride long distances on horseback, often spending entire days traveling across the open land, checking cattle, and repairing fences. The work was exhausting, but it gave him a sense of purpose. Every morning brought a clear task. Every evening ended with the satisfaction of work completed. The men who worked alongside Roosevelt were experienced cowboys who had spent years surviving in this harsh environment. At first, many of them viewed the well-educated man from New York with curiosity and some skepticism. He spoke with the accent of the East and had the manners of someone raised in a comfortable home. Yet Roosevelt surprised them quickly. He refused special treatment and insisted on doing the same difficult work as everyone else. When storms arrived, he rode through them. When long days of labor were required, he worked until the job was finished. Gradually, the cowboys began to respect him, not as a visitor, but as one of their own. Ranch life demanded skills Roosevelt had never needed before. He learned how to track cattle across wide distances, where fences were often broken or non-existent. He learned how to rope animals during roundups, where dozens of riders moved together across the plains, guiding herds toward new grazing areas. He learned how to survive long nights outdoors, when travel made it impossible to return to the ranch house before dark. These experiences strengthened both his body and his confidence. The boy who once struggled with illness had now become a man capable of enduring the physical demands of frontier life. Yet Roosevelt's time in the Dakota Territory was not only about physical challenges. The frontier also gave him time to think deeply about the future of the American landscape. As he rode across the plains, he saw both the beauty and the vulnerability of the natural environment. Vast herds of animals moved through grasslands that seemed endless. But Roosevelt understood that these lands could easily be damaged by careless use. Overhunting and uncontrolled grazing were already beginning to affect wildlife populations in many parts of the country. Roosevelt began to believe that nature itself required protection if it was to survive for future generations. These ideas would later grow into one of the most important parts of his political legacy. But at the time, they were simply quiet thoughts, forming during long rides across open land. Despite the sense of freedom the frontier offered life, there could also be unforgiving. During the winter of 1886 and 1887, one of the most severe winters in the region's history struck the Dakota Territory. Temperatures fell dramatically and heavy snow covered the plains for long periods. Cattle struggled to find grass beneath the frozen ground. Many animals died during those months, and ranchers across the region suffered heavy losses. Roosevelt's ranch was no exception. A large portion of his cattle herd was lost during the harsh winter. The financial damage was significant, but Roosevelt accepted it with the same determination he had shown throughout his life. Ranching on the frontier was always risky, and he understood that nature often decided the outcome regardless of human effort. By 1887, Roosevelt began to realize that his time as a full-time rancher was coming to an end. The frontier had given him something invaluable. It had restored his strength after personal tragedy and deepened his understanding of the land and people of the American West. But Roosevelt also knew that his ambitions extended beyond ranch life. The world of politics and public service still called to him. America was changing rapidly, and Roosevelt believed he could play a role in shaping its future. With renewed energy, he returned to New York and began re-entering political life. His experiences in the West had changed the way he viewed leadership. He now believed even more strongly that courage and action were necessary qualities for anyone in public office. Problems could not simply be discussed endlessly. They had to be faced directly and solved with determination. Roosevelt soon accepted new responsibilities within government. In 1889, he was appointed to the United States Civil Service Commission by President Benjamin Harrison. The Civil Service Commission had been created to reform the way government jobs were awarded. For many years, political leaders had used government positions as rewards for supporters, rather than selecting people based on ability and fairness. Roosevelt strongly supported efforts to change this system. He believed government should serve the public, rather than political machines. During his time on the commission, he worked aggressively to enforce rules that required merit-based hiring within federal departments. His willingness to challenge corruption once again made him both admired and controversial. Some politicians appreciated his commitment to reform, while others considered him difficult because he refused to compromise on issues of fairness. Roosevelt remained convinced that honest government was essential for the nation's future. After several years in Washington, Roosevelt returned once again to New York, where his reputation as a reformer continued to grow. In 1895, he was appointed president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. At that time, the city's police department was widely criticized for corruption and inefficiency. Roosevelt approached the challenge with his usual energy. He personally walked through neighborhoods late at night inspecting police patrols and ensuring officers were performing their duties properly. His direct involvement surprised many people who were accustomed to leaders remaining distant from daily operations. Roosevelt believed leadership required personal example. If he expected discipline from others, he must demonstrate the same discipline himself. The reforms he introduced within the police department improved accountability and public trust, although they also created powerful enemies among those who preferred the old system. By the late 1890s, Theodore Roosevelt had become known across the country as a determined reformer and energetic public servant. Yet an even larger stage awaited him, and events beyond his control were about to push him into the national spotlight in a dramatic and unexpected way. By the late 1890s, Theodore Roosevelt had already lived several very different lives. He had been a sick child who fought to strengthen his body. He had been a student fascinated by history and science. He had been a rancher riding across the open plains of the Dakota Territory. And he had become a determined reformer inside the complex world of American politics. Yet the moment that would bring him national fame was still ahead. In 1897, Roosevelt accepted a new position in Washington. President William McKinley appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The job placed Roosevelt inside one of the most important departments of the federal government, at a time when the United States was beginning to expand its influence beyond its borders. Roosevelt approached the position with intense enthusiasm. He had always been fascinated by naval history and military strategy. Now he had the opportunity to influence the future of the American Navy itself. The Navy during this period was undergoing modernization. New steel warships were replacing older wooden vessels. Advances in technology were transforming how wars at sea might be fought. Roosevelt believed strongly that the United States needed a powerful navy to protect its interests and maintain peace. He spent long hours studying ship designs, naval logistics, and international political developments. His energy impressed many people within the department, but it also made some colleagues nervous. Roosevelt was not a man who liked waiting quietly for events to unfold. He believed in action, and action was approaching quickly. In 1898, tensions between the United States and Spain reached a breaking point. Spain still controlled several overseas territories, including Cuba. which was struggling for independence. Reports of violence and instability in Cuba filled American newspapers. Public opinion in the United States grew increasingly angry toward Spanish rule. The situation exploded in February 1898 when the American battleship Maine suddenly exploded in Havana Harbor. More than 200 sailors died in the disaster. Although the exact cause of the explosion was unclear, many Americans believed Spain was responsible. The call for war spread rapidly across the country. Roosevelt watched these developments closely. He believed that conflict with Spain was becoming inevitable, and he was determined to play an active role if war came. When the United States officially declared war in April 1898, Roosevelt made a dramatic decision. Instead of remaining in Washington, he resigned from his government position so he could join the Army and fight directly in the conflict. Roosevelt helped organize a volunteer cavalry unit that quickly became famous. The regiment was officially known as the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, but the public soon gave them another name: the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a unique group of men drawn from very different backgrounds. Some were skilled cowboys from the American West, who were already experienced horsemen and fighters. Others were athletes, students, and adventurers from wealthy Eastern families. Roosevelt believed this mixture of backgrounds created a strong and energetic fighting force. He served as the regiment's lieutenant colonel, although his natural leadership soon placed him at the center of its activities. Training began quickly as the country prepared for war with Spain. Roosevelt pushed the men hard during these preparations. He believed discipline and readiness would be essential once they reached the battlefield. Despite the challenges of organizing a new volunteer unit, the Rough Riders developed strong unity and confidence under his leadership. In June 1898, the regiment traveled to Cuba, where American forces were preparing to attack Spanish positions near the city of Santiago. The tropical climate brought new difficulties, including intense heat, heavy rain, and unfamiliar diseases that affected many soldiers. Yet Roosevelt remained focused on the mission ahead. The most famous moment of Roosevelt's military service came during the Battle of San Juan Hill on July 1, 1898. American forces needed to capture a series of hills that were heavily defended by Spanish troops. The terrain was difficult, and the attack required courage from every soldier involved. Roosevelt led his men forward during the charge toward the hill. Riding on horseback, he moved through gunfire, encouraging the Rough Riders to continue advancing. The battle was intense, but American forces eventually captured the positions after fierce fighting. Roosevelt's visible courage during the charge quickly became legendary. Newspapers across the United States published dramatic accounts of the battle describing the energetic colonel leading his men forward under fire. Whether every detail reported by journalists was completely accurate mattered less than the powerful image that formed in the public imagination. Theodore Roosevelt had become a national hero. When the war with Spain ended later that year, the Rough Riders returned home to a country that celebrated their bravery. Parades welcomed them in cities across the nation. Roosevelt himself became one of the most recognized figures in America almost overnight. His reputation for courage, combined with his earlier record as a political reformer, created a powerful public image. Many people now believed he represented a new kind of American leadership, energetic, fearless, and determined to act rather than simply talk. Roosevelt's sudden fame quickly influenced his political future. Leaders within the Republican Party recognized that his popularity could help them win elections. In 1898, Roosevelt was encouraged to run for governor of New York. Although the responsibilities of leading such an important state were enormous, Roosevelt accepted the challenge. The election campaign attracted enormous public attention because Roosevelt's name was already known across the country after the war. His speeches focused on honesty and government fair treatment for workers and the need to protect public resources from abuse by powerful interests. When the votes were counted, Theodore Roosevelt had won the election and became governor of New York at the age of 40. As governor, he continued pushing for reforms with the same determination that had defined his earlier career. He supported laws designed to regulate large corporations, improve workplace safety, and protect forests and natural resources from reckless destruction. These policies were sometimes controversial because they challenged powerful economic interests, but Roosevelt believed leadership required the courage to defend the public good. Yet even as he worked intensely, as governor, events were moving him toward an even larger stage. Political leaders within his party soon began discussing the possibility of placing Roosevelt on the national ticket in the next presidential election. Some admired his energy and popularity, while others believed the vice presidency might quietly remove him from the center of political battles in New York. Ironically, this decision, intended by some to limit Roosevelt's influence, would soon place him closer than anyone expected to the highest office in the nation. By the year 1900, Theodore Roosevelt had already become one of the most recognizable figures in American public life. His courage during the Spanish-American War and his energetic leadership as governor of New York had made him widely admired across the country. Yet his political career was still moving in directions he could not fully control. Inside the Republican Party, powerful leaders were preparing for the upcoming presidential election. President William McKinley was expected to run for a second term, and the party needed a candidate for vice president who could help strengthen the ticket. Many voters admired Roosevelt, and his name attracted enormous public attention. For that reason, party leaders began discussing the idea of placing him on the national ticket as McKinley's running mate. The decision was complicated. Some political figures genuinely admired Roosevelt's reform efforts and believed he represented a new generation of leadership. Others, however, had a different motive. Roosevelt's aggressive reforms as governor of New York had created tension with several powerful political groups. Some party leaders believed that moving him to the vice presidency would quietly remove him from state politics, where he had been difficult to control. The vice presidency at that time was not seen as a powerful position. Vice presidents rarely influenced major decisions, and their main responsibility was to preside over the Senate. To some party strategists, it seemed like a convenient way to limit Roosevelt's influence while still benefiting from his popularity during the election campaign. Roosevelt himself initially hesitated. He understood that the vice presidency offered little real authority. As governor, he had been able to pursue reforms directly and influence laws within New York. Accepting the vice presidency might mean stepping away from active leadership, yet the pressure from party leaders and supporters continued to grow. Eventually, Roosevelt agreed to run as McKinley's vice presidential candidate in the election of 1900. The campaign attracted tremendous enthusiasm from voters. Roosevelt traveled widely, delivering energetic speeches that excited crowds wherever he went. His speaking style was direct, passionate, and filled with vivid language that captured people's attention. While McKinley represented stability and experience, Roosevelt represented youthful energy and bold action. Together, they formed a powerful political combination. When the election results were announced, the McKinley-Roosevelt ticket had won decisively. Theodore Roosevelt became Vice President of the United States in March 1901. At the age of 42, he was already one of the youngest men ever to hold such a high national office. Yet despite the honor, Roosevelt soon discovered that his concerns about the limited power of the vice presidency were correct. Much of his time was spent presiding over Senate meetings where his role was largely procedural. He had little influence over the major decisions of the administration. For someone with Roosevelt's restless energy, the position felt frustrating. He often described the job as dull compared with the active leadership he had enjoyed as governor. Still, Roosevelt remained loyal to President McKinley and supported the administration's policies publicly. The quiet routine of vice presidential life continued through the summer of 1901. Then suddenly everything changed. In September 1901, President McKinley traveled to Buffalo, New York, to attend a large public exhibition known as the Pan-American Exposition. These events were designed to celebrate technological progress and strengthen relationships between nations in the Western Hemisphere. On September 6th, while greeting visitors inside the exhibition hall, McKinley was shot by an assassin who had hidden a gun beneath a cloth covering his hand. The attack shocked the nation. McKinley was rushed for medical treatment, and for several days, doctors believed he might recover from his injuries. During this uncertain period, Roosevelt remained calm but concerned. At the time of the shooting, he was traveling in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, where he had gone for a brief vacation. When news reached him, he immediately began traveling toward Buffalo, so he could be available if needed. For several days, reports from doctors suggested that the president's condition was improving. Believing the crisis might pass, Roosevelt continued his trip in the mountains. But on September 14, 1901, the situation suddenly worsened. President McKinley died from complications caused by the gunshot wounds. The country was stunned by the news. Roosevelt was immediately informed and began a rapid journey back to Buffalo through the night. When he arrived early the next morning, he was escorted to the home where government officials had gathered. There, inside a quiet room, Theodore Roosevelt took the oath of office and became the 26th President of the United States. At 42 years old, he was the youngest president in American history. The moment carried enormous responsibility. Roosevelt had not sought the presidency through election. It had come suddenly through tragedy. Many citizens wondered how the energetic reformer would lead the nation now that he held its highest office. Roosevelt understood the seriousness of the moment. In his first statements, he promised to continue the policies of the previous administration, while also bringing his own sense of purpose to the presidency. He believed the president's role was not simply to manage government quietly, but to actively protect the interests of the American people. From the very beginning of his presidency, Roosevelt moved with the same energy that had defined every stage of his life. He worked long hours studying national issues, meeting with advisors, and preparing policies designed to address the challenges facing a rapidly changing country. The United States, at the start of the 20th century, was experiencing enormous industrial growth. Large corporations controlled major industries, including railroads, oil, steel, and banking. While these companies created wealth and jobs, they also held tremendous economic power that sometimes threatened fair competition. Roosevelt believed the federal government had a duty to ensure that powerful corporations followed the law and did not abuse their influence. His approach to this problem soon earned him a new reputation. Roosevelt became known as a trust buster, a leader willing to challenge monopolies that harmed the public interest. Yet his presidency would not focus only on economic reform. Roosevelt also believed deeply in protecting the natural landscapes of the United States, which he had come to love during his years in the American West. These two goals, economic fairness and environmental protection, would soon become central parts of his leadership as president. When Theodore Roosevelt stepped into the presidency in 1901, the United States was entering a new era. The country was growing rapidly. Railroads connected distant regions. Factories produced goods at an astonishing pace. Cities expanded as millions of people moved from farms and small towns seeking new opportunities. Wealth increased dramatically, but so did inequality and tension between powerful corporations and ordinary workers. Roosevelt understood that the presidency could no longer remain a quiet, administrative role. He believed the president should actively guide the nation through these changes and defend the public interest when powerful forces threatened fairness. Roosevelt called his approach the square deal. The idea was simple but powerful. Every American deserved a fair chance in life. Workers deserved protection from dangerous conditions. Businesses deserved fair rules that allowed competition without corruption. Consumers deserved protection from dishonest practices. And the natural resources of the country deserved careful management, so they would remain available for future generations. Roosevelt did not believe that all large corporations were harmful. He understood that modern industry required large organizations, but he believed strongly that no company should become so powerful that it could control markets, destroy competition, or influence government decisions unfairly. In 1902, Roosevelt took a dramatic step to enforce this belief. The federal government filed a lawsuit against a massive railroad company known as the Northern Securities Company. This corporation had been created by powerful financial leaders in order to control major railroads across the northern United States. Many people believed the company had formed a monopoly that violated federal law designed to prevent such concentration of power. Previous presidents had often avoided confronting powerful corporations directly, but Roosevelt decided the law must be applied equally to everyone, regardless of wealth or influence. The legal battle lasted many months and attracted national attention. When the Supreme Court eventually ruled that Northern Securities must be dissolved, the decision sent a powerful message. The federal government would enforce laws designed to maintain fair competition. Roosevelt's actions earned him the reputation of a trust buster, although he later explained that his goal was not to destroy all large companies, but to ensure they operated honestly within the law. Another major test of Roosevelt's leadership came during the coal strike of 1902. Coal miners in Pennsylvania had gone on strike demanding higher wages, shorter working hours, and safer conditions in the mines. Coal was essential for heating homes and powering factories, especially as winter approached. As the strike continued, the country faced the possibility of severe shortages. Previous presidents had often supported business owners during labor disputes, but Roosevelt believed the government should act as a neutral mediator, seeking a fair solution for both sides. He invited representatives of the miners and the mine owners to meet at the White House. Roosevelt made it clear that the suffering of ordinary citizens during the coal shortage could not continue indefinitely. Eventually, the dispute was resolved through negotiation, which resulted in improved conditions for the workers, while allowing the mines to continue operating. The resolution demonstrated Roosevelt's belief that government should actively help resolve conflicts that threaten the stability of the nation. While economic reform occupied much of his attention, Roosevelt also pursued another passion that had grown from his years in the Dakota Territory: the protection of America's natural environment. Roosevelt had seen firsthand how easily forests, wildlife, and open lands could be damaged by uncontrolled exploitation. At the beginning of the 20th century, many forests were being cut down without any plan for renewal. Wildlife populations were declining rapidly in many regions due to overhunting and habitat destruction. Roosevelt believed strongly that these resources belonged not only to the present generation, but also to those who would come in the future. Working with conservation experts, including the naturalist John Muir Roosevelt, began expanding the federal government's role in protecting public lands. During his presidency, millions of acres of forests were placed under federal protection as national forests. Wildlife refuges were established to protect animal populations. New national parks preserved landscapes of extraordinary beauty so that ordinary citizens could experience them. Roosevelt often described conservation as a moral responsibility. The nation, he argued, had been blessed with remarkable natural wealth, and it would be irresponsible to waste those gifts through careless destruction. His policies laid the foundation for the modern American conservation movement and permanently changed how the government approached environmental protection. Roosevelt's energy as president seemed almost limitless. He often worked long hours reviewing documents, meeting advisors, and planning new initiatives. But he also believed strongly in maintaining physical activity, even during the busiest days of leadership. Visitors to the White House sometimes found themselves invited to join the president on long walks through nearby forests or vigorous horseback rides across the countryside. Roosevelt believed that a healthy body supported a strong mind, and he continued practicing the habits of exercise he had developed decades earlier as a sickly child, determined to become stronger. Roosevelt's personality also transformed the public image of the presidency. Previous presidents had often maintained a distant and formal relationship with the public. Roosevelt, however, used speeches, interviews, and public appearances to communicate directly with citizens. His enthusiastic style made him one of the most visible leaders the country had ever known. Newspapers eagerly reported his activities, whether he was negotiating political reforms, delivering speeches, or exploring wilderness areas. Children admired him as a symbol of courage and adventure, while many adults respected his willingness to confront powerful interests in defense of the public good. Yet Roosevelt's leadership extended beyond domestic issues. He also believed the United States should play a stronger role in international affairs. One of his most important diplomatic achievements came in 1905, when he helped negotiate an end to the war between Russia and Japan. The conflict had created instability in East Asia and threatened wider international tensions. Roosevelt invited representatives from both nations to meet in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where negotiations eventually produced a peace agreement. For his role in helping bring the war to an end, Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, making him the first American president to receive that honor. The achievement reflected his belief that strong leadership could be used not only to defend national interests, but also to promote peace between nations. As the years of his presidency continued, Roosevelt remained committed to the idea that government should serve the people actively rather than passively. His energy reforms and bold personality reshaped expectations of what presidential leadership could be. And yet, even with these achievements, his story was far from finished. The next chapter of Theodore Roosevelt's life would test his determination once again, as he faced the question of what to do after leaving the presidency. By 1908, Theodore Roosevelt had spent more than 7 intense years as President of the United States. During that time, he had pushed forward reforms, challenged powerful corporations, protected millions of acres of land, and helped shape a new image of presidential leadership. Yet Roosevelt believed strongly in one principle that surprised many of his supporters. He believed that no president should remain in power for too long. Even though he had come to office unexpectedly after the death of President McKinley and had later won election in his own right, Roosevelt felt that serving another full term might weaken the democratic tradition of peaceful change in leadership. As the next presidential election approached, Roosevelt made a clear decision. He would not run again in 1908. Instead, he chose to support his close friend and Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, as the next candidate for the presidency. Roosevelt trusted Taft deeply and believed he would continue the reform policies that had defined his administration. During the election campaign, Roosevelt used his influence and popularity to help Taft gain support from voters across the country. His speeches praised Taft's honesty, intelligence, and commitment to fair government. When the election results were announced, Taft had won comfortably and would become the next president. Roosevelt felt satisfied that the leadership of the nation was passing to someone he respected. In March 1909, Roosevelt officially left the White House. Many former presidents might have chosen a quiet retirement after such demanding years of leadership. But Roosevelt had no interest in living quietly. Almost immediately, he began planning a new adventure that reflected his lifelong love of exploration in nature. He organized a scientific expedition to Africa. The journey had several purposes. Roosevelt wanted to collect animal specimens for scientific study and museum exhibitions, while also experiencing the landscapes and wildlife of the continent. Accompanied by his son Kermit and a group of scientists and guides, Roosevelt traveled across large areas of East Africa, including regions that are today part of Kenya and Tanzania. The expedition lasted nearly a year and involved long journeys through forests, grasslands, and rivers. Roosevelt observed animals in their natural habitats, studied the environment, and wrote detailed notes describing what he saw. Although some aspects of the expedition reflected the hunting traditions of the time, the scientific collections gathered during the journey later became part of important museum exhibits that helped researchers understand African wildlife more clearly. After returning to the United States in 1910, Roosevelt was welcomed by large crowds who were eager to hear about his travels and his thoughts on the future of the country. During his time away from Washington, he had watched political developments closely. Gradually, he began to feel that the administration of President Taft was not continuing the reform spirit that Roosevelt believed was necessary. Differences between the two men grew larger as debates about government policy intensified. Roosevelt had originally trusted Taft to maintain the square deal approach, but now he believed the government was becoming too cautious and less willing to challenge powerful interests. These disagreements eventually led Roosevelt to make another dramatic political decision. In 1912, he announced that he would once again seek the presidency. This announcement shocked many observers because Roosevelt had previously promised not to run again after his earlier terms. Roosevelt argued, however, that the political situation had changed and that new leadership was necessary to continue the reform movement. When the Republican Party gathered to choose its candidate for the 1912 election, a fierce contest developed between supporters of Roosevelt and supporters of President Taft. The party leadership ultimately selected Taft as the official nominee. Roosevelt and his followers believed the process had been unfair and decided to create a new political organization known as the Progressive Party. Because Roosevelt was known for his energetic personality and strong spirit, the party quickly gained a popular nickname. It became known as the Bull Moose Party, after Roosevelt declared during one speech that he felt as strong as a bull moose. The election campaign that followed was one of the most dramatic in American history. Roosevelt traveled widely delivering speeches that called for stronger protections for workers, stricter regulation of large corporations, and expanded democratic participation in government decisions. He argued that the nation needed bold reforms in order to ensure fairness and opportunity for all citizens. During one campaign stop in Milwaukee, an extraordinary event occurred. As Roosevelt prepared to deliver a speech, he was shot by a man in the crowd who opposed his political ideas. The bullet struck Roosevelt in the chest, but was slowed by a thick speech manuscript and glasses case in his pocket. Remarkably, Roosevelt insisted on delivering his speech before seeking medical treatment. Standing before the audience, he calmly announced that he had been shot, but that it would take more than a bullet to stop a bull moose. He then spoke for nearly an hour, before finally agreeing to receive medical care. The dramatic moment strengthened his reputation for courage, although the injury required him to carry the bullet in his body for the rest of his life. Despite Roosevelt's remarkable campaign, the election results ultimately favored another candidate. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee, won the presidency, while Roosevelt finished second and Taft third. Although Roosevelt did not return to the White House, the election demonstrated that his ideas about reform and active government still held enormous influence among American voters. After the campaign, Roosevelt gradually stepped back from direct political competition, but he remained an important public voice. He continued writing books and articles discussing history, politics, exploration, and leadership. His experiences had given him a unique perspective on the challenges facing modern societies, and he used his writing to share those insights widely. Even outside formal political office, Roosevelt continued inspiring citizens with his belief that courage, hard work, and public responsibility could shape a stronger nation. And as the years passed, his remarkable life continued to unfold with new adventures, challenges, and reflections that would further define his legacy. After the dramatic election of 1912, Theodore Roosevelt stepped away from the center of American politics. But he did not step away from life itself. Retirement was not a word that truly existed in his world. Roosevelt remained restless, curious, and eager for new challenges. The years that followed became a mixture of reflection, adventure writing, and continued influence on public thought. In 1913, Roosevelt accepted an invitation to join an expedition to South America. The journey was organized partly by scientific institutions that wanted to explore little-known regions of the Amazon basin. Roosevelt was fascinated by the idea. For decades, he had explored wilderness in North America and Africa, but the rivers and forests of South America represented an entirely new world. The expedition soon became known as the Roosevelt-Rondon Scientific Expedition, named after Roosevelt, and the Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon, who helped guide the journey. Their goal was to explore a remote river in the Amazon that had been only partially mapped. The river was then called the River of Doubt, because no one was entirely certain where it flowed or how dangerous it might be. Roosevelt and his companions traveled deep into dense rainforest, where thick vegetation blocked sunlight and rivers twisted unpredictably through the landscape. The journey quickly proved far more difficult than anyone expected. Canoes overturned in powerful currents. Supplies were lost. Insects and tropical diseases constantly threatened the health of the explorers. Roosevelt himself suffered serious injuries during the expedition, including a leg infection that caused high fever and intense pain. At one point, his condition became so severe that he believed he might not survive the journey. Yet even during illness, he insisted that the expedition continue. He did not want the entire team to risk failure because of his own suffering. The determination that had defined Roosevelt throughout his life appeared once again during these dangerous weeks in the jungle. Eventually, the group successfully navigated the river and completed one of the most challenging explorations of the Amazon region at that time. Later, the river was renamed the Roosevelt River in recognition of the expedition. When Roosevelt returned home, he was physically weaker than before. The tropical illness and injuries had permanently affected his health, but his mind remained as active as ever. He spent many months writing about the expedition, describing both the beauty and the dangers of the rainforest. His book, Through the Brazilian Wilderness, became another example of his ability to combine adventure observation and storytelling in a way that fascinated readers. Even as his physical strength declined, Roosevelt continued speaking publicly about issues he believed were important for the future of the United States. He remained deeply committed to conservation, the protection of workers, and the idea that government should serve the interests of ordinary citizens rather than powerful economic groups. In 1914, Roosevelt once again demonstrated his willingness to take risks when he helped organize a volunteer military training movement known as the Preparedness Movement. Many Americans believed the country should strengthen its military readiness as tensions grew in Europe, where war had already begun. Roosevelt believed strongly that nations must remain prepared to defend themselves. and he often spoke about the importance of courage, discipline, and national unity. Although he hoped to play a direct role if the United States entered the conflict, his declining health eventually made active service impossible. Still, he encouraged his sons to serve when America joined the First World War in 1917. Several of them entered military service with the same sense of duty that Roosevelt himself had always displayed. One of his sons, Quentin Roosevelt, became a pilot in the war. Tragically, Quentin was killed in combat in 1918 when his airplane was shot down over France. The news deeply saddened Roosevelt, who had already faced many personal losses during his life. Yet he continued to speak proudly of his son's courage and sacrifice, believing that service to one's country was among the highest forms of duty. During his final years, Roosevelt spent much of his time at his home, known as Sagamore Hill, located in Oyster Bay, New York. The house stood on a quiet hill overlooking the water, surrounded by forests, fields, and open spaces that reflected Roosevelt's love of nature. Visitors often found him reading writing or walking through the surrounding land, discussing history, politics, or wildlife with anyone willing to join the conversation. Even in declining health, Roosevelt remained intellectually active. He wrote articles, books, and essays analyzing world events and offering opinions about the future of democracy, leadership, and international relations. Friends and family members sometimes worried that he pushed himself too hard, but Roosevelt believed a life of action and thought was far better than quiet inactivity. On January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 60. News of his death spread quickly across the United States and around the world. Newspapers printed long tributes describing the extraordinary life he had lived. Political leaders from many countries expressed respect for his achievements and influence. For Americans, Roosevelt represented a unique combination of qualities. He was a scholar who loved books and ideas, but also a man of action who believed courage and physical strength were essential virtues. He was a reformer who challenged powerful interests, yet also a patriot who believed deeply in the strength of the nation. He had been a soldier, explorer, writer, naturalist, governor, and president. Few individuals in American history had lived such a varied and energetic life. Even today, Roosevelt's influence can still be seen in many parts of American society. National parks, forests, and wildlife refuges created during his presidency continue protecting millions of acres of natural land. Laws regulating corporations and protecting workers helped shape modern economic policy. His belief that leadership requires courage, responsibility, and active engagement continues to inspire people studying history and politics. Theodore Roosevelt began life as a fragile child who struggled to breathe during long nights of illness. Yet through determination, discipline, curiosity, and courage, he transformed himself into one of the most influential leaders of his era. His story reminds us that strength is not always something we are born with. Sometimes it is something we build step by step through the choices we make and the challenges we refuse to avoid. When Theodore Roosevelt died in January 1919, the world had already changed dramatically from the one into which he had been born. The 19th century had been an age of horses' candles and slow travel. By the time of his death, airplanes crossed the sky, telephones connected distant cities, and powerful industries shaped the daily lives of millions of people. Roosevelt had lived through this transformation, and in many ways, he had helped guide the nation through it. Yet the story of his life did not end with his passing. In the years that followed, historians, writers, and political leaders began examining what Roosevelt had truly accomplished. Many quickly realized that his influence reached far beyond the specific laws or policies he had supported during his presidency. Roosevelt had changed the expectations of leadership itself. Before his time, many presidents had treated the office as a position of quiet administration. They waited for Congress to propose laws and often avoided direct involvement in national debates. Roosevelt believed the president should act as the voice of the people and use the authority of the office to guide the country toward fairness, stability, and progress. This philosophy shaped how later presidents approached their responsibilities. Future leaders increasingly used the presidency as a platform for national reform and communication with the public. Roosevelt's approach also reshaped the relationship between government and large corporations. During the rapid industrial expansion of the late 19th century, enormous companies had gained extraordinary power over railroads, oil, steel, and other essential industries. Roosevelt did not believe business success itself was wrong, but he believed the government had a duty to prevent abuses of power that harmed workers, consumers, or smaller competitors. His willingness to challenge monopolies through legal action helped establish the idea that economic power must remain accountable to democratic institutions. This principle continued influencing American economic policy long after Roosevelt left office. Perhaps even more visible today is Roosevelt's legacy in conservation and environmental protection. During his presidency, he created national forests, wildlife refuges, and national monuments across the United States. These protected areas preserved landscapes, wildlife habitats, and natural resources that might otherwise have disappeared under uncontrolled development. At the time, some critics argued that such protections would limit economic growth. But Roosevelt insisted that responsible conservation was necessary for long-term prosperity. He often explained that natural resources should be used wisely rather than destroyed recklessly. The forests, rivers, mountains, and wildlife of a nation he believed were part of its true wealth. Today, millions of people visit national parks and protected lands that exist partly because of policies Roosevelt championed more than a century ago. Beyond specific policies, Roosevelt also left a cultural legacy. He represented a certain ideal of energetic citizenship. Roosevelt believed individuals should live actively both physically and intellectually. He encouraged people to read, widely explore nature, participate in public life, and remain curious about the world. His speeches often emphasized the importance of character discipline, courage, and responsibility. These ideas became closely associated with Roosevelt's public image. Many Americans saw him not only as a political leader, but also as an example of personal determination. Roosevelt's life demonstrated that weakness could be overcome through effort, and that education, curiosity, and physical strength could coexist in a single person. Writers often described him as the embodiment of what he called the strenuous life. By this phrase, Roosevelt meant a life filled with purposeful action. He believed people should seek challenges rather than avoid them. Struggle and effort, he argued, built stronger individuals and stronger societies. This philosophy resonated with many citizens who admired his willingness to face danger, hardship, and political opposition without hesitation. Yet Roosevelt was not simply admired for courage. he was also respected for intellectual depth. Few political leaders in American history have written as many books and articles as Roosevelt did during his lifetime. His works covered subjects ranging from naval history and politics to wildlife exploration and personal philosophy. Through these writings, Roosevelt shared his ideas with readers far beyond the halls of government. His books about hunting, exploration, and natural history revealed a deep appreciation for the complexity of the natural world. His political essays discussed the responsibilities of democracy and the challenges faced by modern industrial societies. The combination of intellectual curiosity and physical action made Roosevelt an unusual figure in public life. Many leaders specialize in either thought or action, but Roosevelt insisted that both were necessary for meaningful leadership. In the decades after his death, Roosevelt's image continued appearing in American culture in many forms. His face was eventually carved into the granite of Mount Rushmore, alongside 3 other presidents who shaped the nation's history. The massive monument located in South Dakota stands as a symbol of American leadership and national memory. Visitors who look upon Roosevelt's carved face often remember his role in expanding the nation's sense of responsibility toward both its citizens and its natural environment. Historians continue debating certain aspects of Roosevelt's policies and decisions, as they do with any influential figure from the past. Some of his views reflected the attitudes of his era, while others were remarkably forward-thinking. What remains clear, however, is that Roosevelt approached leadership with extraordinary intensity and sincerity. He believed deeply in the idea that a nation must constantly strive to improve itself. Democracy, in his view, was not a finished achievement, but an ongoing effort requiring vigilance, courage, and participation from every generation. Roosevelt's family also continued contributing to public life after his death. His distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt would later become president during another period of national crisis, leading the country through the Great Depression and the Second World War. Although the 2 men were separated by time and circumstance, their shared belief in active government and public responsibility reflected a family tradition of engagement with national challenges. In quiet moments, visitors to Sagamore Hill, where Theodore Roosevelt once lived, can still walk the same paths he once traveled. The house remains preserved as a historical site, surrounded by the trees, fields, and shoreline that Roosevelt loved so deeply. Standing there, one can imagine the energetic figure who once moved quickly through those rooms discussing books, politics, wildlife, and the future of the country with equal enthusiasm. His voice is no longer heard, but the ideas he championed continue echoing through American history. Even long after Theodore Roosevelt's death, people continued asking the same question: what truly made him so different from other leaders of his time? Many presidents had held power, and many soldiers had shown bravery in battle. Yet Roosevelt seemed to combine an unusual number of qualities within a single life. He was at once a thinker, an explorer, a writer, a reformer, and a man who seemed almost constantly in motion. To understand Roosevelt, it helps to return once again to the beginning of his story. As a child, he had faced weakness, illness, and long nights struggling simply to breathe. Those early experiences shaped the way he viewed life forever. Roosevelt believed that comfort and ease were not the true goals of existence. Instead, he believed growth came from challenge, effort, and curiosity. He once wrote that people should do what they could with what they had where they were. That simple philosophy guided nearly every decision he made. Roosevelt never waited for perfect circumstances. When he wanted to learn about science, he built a small museum in his bedroom and studied animals carefully. When he wanted to become physically stronger, he trained in a simple home gym until his body improved. When he wanted to explore new ideas, he read books constantly and wrote down his thoughts. And when he believed political change was necessary, he entered public life rather than watching from the sidelines. Curiosity was one of the strongest forces shaping Roosevelt's personality. Throughout his life, he asked questions about nearly everything he encountered. During his travels, he studied animals, landscapes, languages, and cultures with the same enthusiasm. In Africa, he examined wildlife and recorded detailed notes about behavior and environment. In the American West, he observed how ecosystems functioned across grasslands, rivers, and forests. During the Amazon expedition, he documented plants, insects, and animals rarely seen by scientists of his time. Roosevelt did not see the natural world simply as scenery. He saw it as a living system full of complex relationships worth understanding and protecting. His curiosity extended beyond nature into human society as well. Roosevelt studied history deeply because he believed the past offered lessons for the present. Leaders who ignored history, he argued, were more likely to repeat mistakes. He admired figures from earlier centuries who had shown courage, discipline, and moral conviction during difficult times. Yet Roosevelt never believed admiration for the past should prevent societies from improving themselves. He believed each generation carried the responsibility to build something better than what existed before. That belief explains much of Roosevelt's determination during his years in public office. He believed government should not remain passive while problems grew worse. When he saw corruption in politics, he tried to expose it. When he saw workers facing dangerous conditions, he supported laws to improve safety and fairness. When he saw forests disappearing rapidly, he expanded conservation programs to protect them. These actions were not always popular with powerful interests, but Roosevelt believed leadership required the willingness to accept criticism if necessary in order to serve the broader public good. Another quality that defined Roosevelt's life was his belief in the value of effort itself. He often encouraged young people to pursue what he called the strenuous life. By this phrase, he meant a life filled with purpose, discipline, and willingness to face challenges rather than avoid them. Roosevelt did not believe happiness came from comfort alone. Instead, he believed satisfaction came from striving toward meaningful goals. Whether the goal involved learning, building, protecting, or serving others, the effort itself strengthened character. This philosophy shaped how Roosevelt approached both success and failure. When his ranching business suffered heavy losses during a brutal winter, he accepted the outcome and continued forward. When he lost political battles, he used the experience as motivation to work harder for the ideas he believed in. When illness and injuries weakened him later in life, he continued writing, speaking, and thinking as actively as possible. Roosevelt's energy often amazed the people around him. Friends described how he could read a book quickly, then immediately discuss its ideas with remarkable clarity. During conversations, he moved rapidly from one topic to another, linking history, politics, science, and personal experience together in ways that fascinated listeners. Yet despite this intense activity, Roosevelt also valued quiet moments spent in nature. Walking through forests or observing animals along rivers allowed him to think calmly and reflect on the larger patterns shaping the world. These moments reminded him that human societies were only one part of a much larger natural system. In that sense, Roosevelt's conservation efforts reflected not only political strategy, but also personal philosophy. Protecting nature meant protecting something essential about the human experience itself. People needed wild places, he believed, because such places reminded them of humility, courage, and the deeper rhythms of life beyond cities and industry. Today, when people walk through protected forests, national parks, or wildlife refuges, many of those landscapes still exist, because Roosevelt insisted they should remain preserved. Yet perhaps Roosevelt's most enduring legacy is not a specific law or protected forest, but a broader idea about citizenship. Roosevelt believed democracy required active participation from its citizens. A healthy nation, he argued, depended on people who were willing to think critically, work hard, remain informed, and care about the well-being of others. Passive spectatorship was not enough. Citizenship required engagement, curiosity, responsibility, and courage. Roosevelt tried to live according to these principles throughout his life. From the sick child determined to strengthen his body to the president challenging powerful interests, he consistently acted on the belief that individuals could shape the world through determination and thoughtful action. And that belief continues inspiring people long after his voice has fallen silent. When people remember Theodore Roosevelt, they often think first about dramatic images. They imagine the energetic president charging up San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders. They picture the powerful voice delivering speeches about courage and national strength. They see the famous photograph of the smiling leader with round glasses and a confident posture. These images have become symbols of Roosevelt's personality, but behind the legend stood a complex human being shaped by years of struggle, curiosity, discipline, and reflection. Roosevelt was not born fearless. In fact, many of the qualities people later admired in him were developed slowly over time. His childhood asthma forced him to confront weakness earlier than most children. The long nights when he could barely breathe taught him something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. They taught him that fear and discomfort could not always be avoided, but they could be faced. That lesson became a foundation for his entire philosophy of life. Instead of allowing illness to define him, Roosevelt chose to challenge it. The small gym his father built at home became a symbol of this decision. Each exercise represented an act of resistance against limitation. Each small improvement strengthened his belief that effort could change outcomes. As he grew older, this mindset expanded beyond physical strength. Roosevelt began applying the same discipline to his studies, his writing, and eventually his leadership in public life. Another important part of Roosevelt's character was his love of reading and learning. Books were not simply entertainment for him. They were tools that allowed him to explore new ideas and understand the experiences of people who had lived centuries before him. Roosevelt read history biographies, science and philosophy with equal enthusiasm. His personal library eventually contained thousands of volumes, and he often read several books at once, moving quickly between subjects. Friends sometimes joked that Roosevelt read faster than most people could speak, but his reading was not shallow. He remembered details and used them during conversations, speeches, and writing. Through books, Roosevelt felt connected to the broader story of humanity. He saw leadership not as a personal achievement, but as a continuation of ideas developed across generations. Roosevelt also possessed an unusual ability to combine intellectual curiosity with physical adventure. Many scholars spend their lives studying ideas, while explorers often focus on physical challenges. Roosevelt refused to separate the two worlds. For him, knowledge and action belonged together. He could spend hours discussing historical events, then ride horseback for miles across rough landscapes the same day. This combination made him difficult to categorize. Some people admired him as a thinker, while others admired him as a man of action. But Roosevelt saw no contradiction between the two identities. In his mind, the best life required both thought and experience. Family also played an important role in shaping Roosevelt's character. His father remained one of the most influential figures in his early life. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. believed strongly in generosity, responsibility, and service to others. Watching his father work tirelessly to help people in need taught Roosevelt that success carried moral obligations. Wealth and privilege, he believed, should not lead to selfishness, but to greater responsibility toward society. Roosevelt carried this belief into politics, where he argued that leaders must serve the public rather than their own interests. At the same time, Roosevelt's life included moments of deep personal sorrow. The deaths of his wife and mother on the same day left emotional scars that never fully disappeared. During those dark months, Roosevelt withdrew from the world, seeking solitude on the western frontier. The vast plains of the Dakota Territory provided space for reflection and healing. Riding across the open land, Roosevelt rediscovered a sense of purpose that grief had temporarily taken away. The experience also strengthened his appreciation for the natural world and reinforced his belief that wilderness held important lessons about resilience, humility, and independence. Roosevelt's friendships also influenced his life in meaningful ways. Throughout his career, he surrounded himself with people who challenged his ideas and expanded his understanding of complex issues. Scientists, writers, politicians, soldiers, and explorers all appeared among his acquaintances. Roosevelt enjoyed debate and welcomed disagreement because he believed strong ideas should withstand careful examination. This intellectual openness helped him refine many of his policies while serving in government. Although Roosevelt was often described as bold or aggressive, he also possessed a reflective side that sometimes surprised people who knew only his public image. In private letters and diary entries, he often analyzed his own decisions, asking whether he had acted wisely or whether different choices might have produced better results. This habit of self-examination revealed a leader who understood that power carried enormous responsibility. Roosevelt believed mistakes were inevitable, but ignoring them was unacceptable. Learning from errors, he argued, was essential for personal growth and effective leadership. Another striking feature of Roosevelt's personality was his enthusiasm. Whether he was discussing wildlife conservation, military strategy, literature, or political reform, he spoke with an intensity that captured attention. Listeners often left conversations with him feeling energized because Roosevelt communicated his ideas with genuine excitement. This enthusiasm made him an effective speaker and helped him connect with audiences from many different backgrounds. Workers, farmers, students, soldiers, and scholars could all find something appealing in Roosevelt's passionate descriptions of national purpose and individual responsibility. Roosevelt also believed deeply in the importance of optimism. Even during difficult periods, he tried to focus on possibilities rather than obstacles. He acknowledged that society faced serious problems, but he believed progress was achievable when people worked together with determination and honesty. This optimistic outlook helped him maintain energy during political battles that might have discouraged other leaders. At the same time, Roosevelt remained realistic about human nature. He understood that power could tempt individuals toward corruption and that democratic systems required constant vigilance to remain healthy. That understanding motivated his efforts to strengthen government accountability and protect fair competition within the economy. Roosevelt's life demonstrated that leadership involves balancing many different qualities at once. Strength without thought can become reckless. Thought without action can become ineffective. Roosevelt attempted to combine courage, curiosity, discipline, compassion, and responsibility into a single approach to life. The result was a personality that fascinated supporters and critics alike. More than a century later, historians still study his decisions, his writings, and his adventures, searching for insight into the character of a man who refused to live quietly. When Theodore Roosevelt died in 1919, the world entered a new and uncertain period. The First World War had just ended. Nations across Europe were rebuilding from enormous destruction, and the United States was beginning to step into a larger role in global affairs. Roosevelt did not live to see how the 20th century would unfold, but many of the ideas he defended during his lifetime continued influencing political thought long after his death. In many ways, Roosevelt helped shape a new understanding of leadership in a modern democratic nation. One of the most important ideas he promoted was the belief that government should serve as an active guardian of the public interest. Before Roosevelt's presidency, many Americans believed the federal government should remain small and limited in its actions. Roosevelt did not reject the importance of individual freedom, but he argued that freedom could not exist fully if powerful economic forces were allowed to dominate society without restraint. Large corporations during the industrial age possessed enormous influence over transportation, energy manufacturing, and finance. Roosevelt believed that when such power grew unchecked, it could threaten both economic fairness and democratic institutions. His efforts to enforce antitrust laws signaled that the government would intervene when monopolies abused their position. This approach did not destroy American industry as some critics feared. Instead, it established the principle that economic success must exist alongside public accountability. The balance between business growth and public oversight remains a central debate in modern economic policy, and Roosevelt's actions helped define how that balance might work in practice. Roosevelt also helped change how Americans viewed the natural environment. During the 19th century, many people believed that forests, rivers, and wildlife existed primarily as resources to be used as quickly as possible. The United States contained vast lands, and it often seemed that natural resources would never run out. Roosevelt challenged that assumption. Drawing from his experiences in the Dakota Territory and his observations during travels across the country, he argued that careless exploitation could destroy ecosystems that required centuries to develop. Roosevelt's conservation philosophy did not mean preventing all use of natural resources. Instead, he advocated what he called wise use. Forests could be harvested, but they should be managed, so new growth replaced what was cut. Rivers could provide water and energy, but they should be protected from pollution that would harm communities and wildlife. Wildlife populations could support hunting, but only if regulations prevented species from being hunted to extinction. These ideas eventually formed the foundation of modern environmental policy. National forests, wildlife refuges, and national parks, created during Roosevelt's presidency, remain among the most visible examples of his conservation legacy. Millions of people each year visit protected landscapes that might otherwise have disappeared under industrial expansion. Yet Roosevelt believed conservation involved more than protecting scenery. He believed natural environments shaped the character of citizens who experienced them. Time spent in wild places encouraged humility, resilience, and appreciation for the complexity of life. Roosevelt feared that if future generations grew up surrounded only by cities and factories, they might lose connection with the natural world that had shaped human history for thousands of years. By preserving wilderness areas, he hoped to ensure that people would continue learning these lessons. Roosevelt also influenced how Americans thought about citizenship and national responsibility. He believed democracy required more than voting during elections. It required citizens who remained informed, engaged, and willing to participate in public life. Roosevelt often warned that apathy could be as dangerous to democracy as corruption. When citizens stopped paying attention to government decisions, powerful interests could quietly shape policies for their own benefit. Roosevelt therefore encouraged active participation in civic discussions. He believed disagreements were healthy when conducted honestly because they forced societies to examine competing ideas carefully. The ability to debate policies openly, he argued, was one of democracy's greatest strengths. Roosevelt's ideas about leadership also emphasized personal character. He believed that public office required integrity, courage, and willingness to accept responsibility for difficult decisions. Leaders should not seek popularity at the cost of honesty. Instead, they should explain their reasoning clearly and trust that citizens would eventually respect sincerity, even when they disagreed with specific policies. Roosevelt himself faced significant criticism during his career, but he rarely changed his views simply to avoid controversy. He believed leadership meant guiding public opinion toward better solutions rather than following temporary trends. Another lasting aspect of Roosevelt's legacy was his approach to international relations. During his presidency, the United States began playing a more active role in global affairs. Roosevelt believed that strong nations should use their influence responsibly to maintain peace and stability. His mediation of the conflict between Russia and Japan demonstrated that diplomatic leadership could sometimes prevent wars from expanding further. At the same time, Roosevelt believed that peaceful diplomacy was most effective when supported by credible national strength. This balance between negotiation and preparedness became a recurring theme in American foreign policy during the 20th century. Roosevelt's personal writings also contributed to the survival of his ideas. Through books, essays, speeches, and letters, he explained his philosophy of life and leadership in his own words. These writings allowed later generations to study his thinking directly, rather than relying only on historical summaries. In these texts, Roosevelt discussed topics ranging from wildlife conservation to the responsibilities of democratic citizenship. He often wrote in a clear, energetic style that reflected his personality. Readers could sense the enthusiasm that drove him throughout his life. Roosevelt's influence also appeared in the lives of later leaders who admired his example. Many politicians in the 20th century studied Roosevelt's presidency when considering how to balance economic growth, environmental protection, and social reform. His distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who served as president during the Great Depression, often spoke about Theodore Roosevelt's impact on his own political thinking. Although their circumstances were very different, both men believed that government should actively help citizens during periods of crisis. Today, historians continue analyzing Roosevelt's achievements with both admiration and critical reflection. Some of his views reflected the attitudes of his era, which sometimes included assumptions modern readers question or debate. Yet even critics generally agree that Roosevelt's energy, curiosity, and willingness to confront difficult issues left a lasting mark on American history. Few leaders have lived with such intensity across so many different fields of activity. Roosevelt was at once a student of history, a lover of nature, a reformer in politics, a soldier in war, an explorer of distant lands, and a writer who shared his thoughts with the world. The ideas he defended about courage, responsibility, conservation, and active citizenship continue shaping discussions about leadership more than a century later. And in that sense, the voice of Theodore Roosevelt never fully disappeared. It continues echoing wherever people debate how a nation should grow, while remaining fair, strong, and connected to the natural world that sustains it. By the time Theodore Roosevelt entered the final years of his life, the world around him was moving faster than ever before. New technologies were transforming everyday life. Automobiles were replacing horses in city streets. Airplanes had begun to cross the sky. Radios would soon connect distant voices across entire nations. Roosevelt watched these changes with great interest, even as his own health slowly weakened after decades of intense activity. Yet his mind remained sharp and curious. Even during quieter periods at his home in Oyster Bay, he continued reading, writing, and discussing ideas with visitors who came from many parts of the country. Sagamore Hill, the house where he lived during these years, was filled with books, maps, hunting trophies, and souvenirs from his travels. The building stood on a hill surrounded by trees and open land overlooking the water. It was a place where Roosevelt could reflect on the extraordinary path his life had taken. Visitors often described how energetic he still seemed when speaking about history, politics, or the natural world. Conversations with Roosevelt rarely stayed on a single topic for long. One moment, he might describe the habits of a bird he had observed years earlier in the Dakota plains. The next moment, he might analyze a political event unfolding in Europe. His curiosity never faded, yet the physical toll of his many adventures had begun to show. The injuries and illnesses he had suffered during the Amazon expedition years earlier had never fully healed. Periods of fatigue became more frequent, and doctors often advised him to rest more than he preferred. Roosevelt listened politely, but rarely followed such advice for long. The habit of action had become too deeply embedded in his character. Even when confined indoors, he remained mentally active, writing essays and letters discussing the future of democracy and the responsibilities of leadership. Roosevelt also continued spending time outdoors whenever his strength allowed it. Walking through the fields and woods surrounding Sagamore Hill gave him the same quiet satisfaction he had experienced decades earlier while exploring the western frontier. Nature remained a source of calm reflection. He believed the natural world offered lessons about patience, resilience, and the larger rhythms of life that existed beyond politics and human conflict. In conversations with friends, Roosevelt sometimes reflected on the many roles he had played throughout his life. He had been a student fascinated by science and history. He had been a rancher riding across the open plains of the Dakota Territory. He had been a soldier leading volunteers during war. He had been governor, vice president, and president of the United States. Few individuals had experienced such a wide range of responsibilities and adventures. Yet Roosevelt rarely spoke about these achievements with pride alone. Instead, he often emphasized the importance of effort rather than personal recognition. He believed a meaningful life was defined not by titles or fame, but by the willingness to face challenges and serve others when possible. As the winter of 1918 turned into the new year, Roosevelt spent increasing amounts of time resting at home. The country itself was recovering from the enormous strain of the First World War, which had finally ended only weeks earlier. Roosevelt followed the news carefully, still offering opinions through letters and articles when he felt they might contribute to public debate. On the evening of January 5th, 1919, Roosevelt went to bed as usual at Sagamore Hill. The house was quiet. Family members moved softly through the rooms, while winter winds brushed gently against the windows outside. Sometime during the night, Roosevelt passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 60 years old. The news spread quickly across the country the following morning. Newspapers reported the death of one of the most energetic and influential figures of the American age. Messages of respect arrived from political leaders, soldiers, scholars, and ordinary citizens who had followed Roosevelt's remarkable career. Many remembered him not only as a president, but as a symbol of determination, curiosity, and courage. One political leader reportedly said simply that death had to take Roosevelt while he slept, because if he had been awake, there might have been a fight. The remark captured something essential about the man. Theodore Roosevelt had lived with relentless energy, refusing to step back from challenge, whether physical, intellectual, or political. His life had been filled with action, but also with reflection, learning, and service. The fragile boy who once struggled to breathe had grown into a leader who believed strength could be built through discipline, curiosity, and courage. And although his voice had fallen silent, the ideas he championed about conservation responsibility and active citizenship would continue shaping the nation long after that quiet winter morning.